Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775. She was a daughter of George and Cassandra Austen, and she had 6 brothers and 1 sister, Cassandra, to whom she was especially close. Jane grew up in the rectory in the village of Steventon in Hampshire, where her father was the rector. The Austen children were encouraged to learn and think creatively. They read their father's extensive library, wrote and put on plays and charades. To acquire a more formal education, Jane and Cassandra went to boarding school in 1783. In the autumn of that year, both girls caught typhus at school and Jane nearly died. For the next 2 years, the sisters were educated at home before spending a year at a boarding school in Reading, where they studied French, spelling, needlework, dancing, music and drama. By December 1786, the school fees were too high for Jane's father to pay, so the sisters had to return home. Jane's father ran a school to prepare the sons of the local gentry for university from the Steventon rectory, and tutored his own sons and daughters when they were at home. Since her childhood, Jane scribbled stories in bound notebooks and was fortunate that her family was supportive of her writing efforts, as paper was taxed and so notebooks are expensive at the time. In the 1790s, she started to craft her own novels. One early novella was Love and Friendship, a witty parody of the romantic novels popular at the time. One of the aspects that she made fun of was the prevalence of sensibility or romanticism taken to hysterical levels, which she later used as a theme in her novel Sense and Sensibility. Love and Friendship was written as a series of letters. This was a popular format for novels at the time. The next book that Jane wrote, The History of England, was a parody of historical writing accompanied by illustrations drawn by Cassandra. Jane spent her time helping to run the family home, playing the pianoforte, attending church, visiting neighbours and dancing in assemblies. It was at one of these dances that Jane began a flirtation with Tom Lefroy, an Irish relative of her friend Mrs. Anne Lefroy. Tom was taking a break from his law studies in London when he met Jane. However, there is no evidence that he ever proposed to her. He returned to his uncle's house in London to continue his studies and would go on to marry another woman and become a politician. Although Jane never married, she did once accept a proposal from Harris Bigwiver, the brother of her friends Catherine and Althea, only to turn him down the next day. Cassandra too was unlucky in love, as Tom Fowle, the man she became engaged to, died after catching an illness in the West Indies, where he had gone as a chaplain to his regiment. Alongside the typical activities of a Regency rector's daughter, Jane continued her budding career as an author. Her next story, Lady Susan, gave a witty account of a manipulative woman, paving the way for her later novels, which often feature social climbing characters cast in a humorous light. Eleanor and Marianne, the story that would become Sense and Sensibility, was penned by Jane around 1789. Aged 21, Jane began First Impressions, a novel which her father offered to a publisher who refused it. Later, First Impressions would be published as Pride and Prejudice. In her early 20s, Jane also worked on a prototype for Northanger Abbey, which was published after her death. Although her father retired from the ministry in 1801, he moved to Bath and his wife and daughters, and he died 4 years later after a short illness. Mrs. Austen and her daughters were not left well off and spent the next few years moving from place to place. living in either the homes of various family members or in rented flats. In 1809, Jane's brother Edward, who had been adopted by the wealthy Knight family at the age of 12, offered his mother and sisters a home in a cottage in Chawton, a Hampshire village that formed part of the estate that he had inherited from the Knight family. The cottage is now the Jane Austen House Museum. Whilst living at Chawton, Jane started to anonymously publish her novels. Between 1811 and 1816, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park and Emma were published. In 1816, aged 41, Jane became terminally ill. Whilst the cause of her death is uncertain, many think that it may have been due to Addison's disease, arising from problems with the adrenal gland. Despite her illness, she continued writing, starting a new novel called The Brothers, which would be published unfinished after her death as Sanditon. Jane died on the 18th of July 1817 in Winchester, where she and Cassandra had gone to consult a physician in the hope of finding a cure for Jane's illness. Jane is buried in Winchester Cathedral. I chose to begin my research for my book, Jane Austen's Easter, after reading books and online articles that focused on how Jane Austen would have celebrated Christmas. However, as the daughter of a clergyman, Jane Austen would have celebrated other Christian festivals and viewed Easter as a time of special significance. I wanted to find out more about how Easter specifically might have been celebrated in the Regency era, and began by reading Jane Austen's letters and novels and then relating them to the wider context of Easter. The origins of Easter are pagan. Easter is named after the Anglo-Saxon goddess Oestra, mentioned by the Venerable Bede in the 8th century. She was the goddess of spring and dawn, and her animal associates there included the hare. Oestra's hare is the origin of the Easter bunny story. It is easy to see how Christians linked pagan celebrations of dawn and new life to the resurrection of Christ. Spring feels like a time of new hope as it marks the transition from winter to summer, with plants beginning to grow and animals and birds raising their young. I wrote my book during the COVID lockdowns when the news and restrictions felt bleak at times, but I found that focusing on the subject of spring and the life of one of my favourite authors was comforting. As an Anglican, Jane would have observed 40 days of fasting called Lent, a time when the congregation ate a simple diet on all days apart from Sunday in the period up until Easter, when they would be able to enjoy feasting again. The Puritans banned the celebration of Easter, Whitsun and Christmas in 1647 because they saw them as times of gluttony and drunkenness. Fortunately, by Jane Austen's time, celebrating Easter had long been reinstated. At Easter, tithes were traditionally paid to the church. Tithes were paid either as a portion of the income earned by parishioners or else as payment in kind, with agricultural produce given by the rural poor to the rector's family. In discussing the duties of a clergyman, worldly Mr. Collins places selfish considerations before godly duties and states in Pride and Prejudice that the rector of a parish has much to do. In the first place, he must make such an agreement for tithes as may be beneficial to himself and not offensive to his patron. The timing of Easter Day is decided by the first full moon following the spring equinox, on or after the 21st of March. Therefore, Easter can be any Sunday between the 21st of March and the 25th of April. Easter is the only Christian holiday whose date is determined by the moon. Easter Day is the Sunday during a Holy Week in which every day has a religious significance. The Easter Holy Week begins with Palm Sunday, which commemorates Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem riding a donkey. He was greeted by Christians carrying palm fronds, which symbolise victory and peace. Palm Sunday is followed by Holy Monday, Holy Tuesday and Holy Wednesday. Maundy Thursday commemorates the Last Supper that Jesus ate with his disciples the day before he was crucified on Good Friday. On Holy Saturday, Jesus lay in his tomb. On Easter Sunday, Jesus was miraculously resurrected. As her father was a clergyman, Jane Austen would have known that Easter and Christmas were some of the only times of the year when even the most indolent of Regency clergymen were expected to write their own original sermons. In Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins produced only 2 sermons between his ordination at Easter and his visit to Longbourn in November of the same year. Easter was a popular time for clergymen to be ordained due to its associations with new beginnings. It seems that church duties at Easter time, Jane Austen hints that Mr. Collins may have been remiss in not spending more time on his church duties at Easter time, as we hear of Mr. Collins driving his father-in-law around the countryside every day during his visit, and of dinners at Rosings with Lady Catherine de Bourgh. But there is no mention of any church activities. Easter Monday is commonly a bank holiday today, although this wouldn't have been the case in Jane Austen's time, as the Easter Monday bank holiday was only introduced in Britain in the Bank Holidays Act of 1871 as a day when banks closed for trade. After Easter, Anglicans continued to celebrate Christ's resurrection and the salvation it brought to humanity until Whitsuntide. This period of 50 days is the origin of the Easter holidays. Although a 50-day-long holiday seems extraordinary now, for wealthy people in Regency Britain, this was a time when they left their work on political or business concerns in town and enjoyed time in their country houses, or went to visit relatives and friends. Easter has as many traditions as Christmas, although ways of celebrating Easter vary from place to place. Centuries-old Easter customs in Britain include well dressing, beating the bounds and morris dancing. Well dressing is still practised in many Derbyshire villages. At Easter, wells are decorated with beautiful pictures traditionally made from flowers. The pictures give thanks for the coming of spring. Perhaps Elizabeth Bennet witnessed well dressing at Easter in local villages after she married Mr. Darcy and moved to his estate at Pemberley in Derbyshire. Beating the bounds is a custom that Jane Austen's clergyman father may have participated in at Steventon. To beat the bounds, the clergymen, village elders and boys with sticks walk along the parish boundaries. The boys would use the sticks to strike the boundary markers, whilst the clergymen and elders gave thanks for the hope brought to Christians through the resurrection of Christ. Morris dancing, a delightful Easter custom where dancers in colourful costumes with ribbons, bells, sashes and flowers dance to the music of folk instruments like fiddles and accordions, was enjoyed by country peasants, and is perhaps the kind of rustic dancing that Mr. Darcy has in mind when he retorts to Sir William Lucas's comment that "there is nothing like dancing after all. I consider it one of the first refinements of polished societies," by haughtily replying, "Certainly, sir, and it has the advantage also of being in vogue amongst the less polished societies of the world. Every savage can dance." Easter was a time of the mop or goose fairs where servants might go to seek jobs. Usually they held something to denote their area of work, so they could be identified by prospective employers. For example, a cook might hold a wooden spoon, or a dairymaid might carry a milking pail. During Easter fairs, there would be a shift race for peasant girls to have the chance to win a new shift, a simple smock-like garment that might be worn under a dress. Whilst Jane Austen would not have had chocolate Easter eggs that have become an important part of Easter today, she may have used blown egg decorations at Easter time, and she would have been familiar with the symbolic connotations of eggs and Easter. Eggs have been associated with rebirth and spring since pagan times. Christians capitalised on this association by linking eggs to Christ's resurrection. The hatching chick is a symbol of new life, recalling Jesus emerging from the tomb after he was crucified. Meals including eggs are mentioned in Jane's novels, including this amusing comment by Emma's hypochondriac father, Mr. Woodhouse. He takes eating what he considers to be wholesome food seriously, and fortunately has a good cook, Searle, who prepares what Mr. Woodhouse sees as healthy foods like boiled eggs. Here, Mr. Woodhouse tries to impose healthy eating on his acquaintances. Mrs. Bates, let me propose your venturing on one of these eggs. An egg boiled very soft is not unwholesome. Searle understands boiling an egg better than anybody. I would not recommend an egg boiled by anybody else, but you need not be afraid. They are very small, you see. One of our small eggs will not hurt you. Hen eggs were traditionally decorated for Easter using natural dyes. For example, wrapping the eggs in onion skins and boiling them gave a mottled golden appearance. Wealthy people even used papier-mâché eggs decorated with velvet and ribbons or covered with gold leaf to enclose small Easter gifts. The two halves of the egg would be tied together with ribbon. Pace egg rolling was a popular Easter tradition in many parts of Regency Britain. The name pace egg comes from pash, an archaic word meaning Passover or Easter. In Lancashire, pace eggs were customarily rolled down a hill to symbolise the stone being rolled away from Christ's tomb when he rose from death. The egg rolling contest would be won by the person whose egg went the furthest. Another traditional Easter game is egg smacking. This involved banging two eggs together held in the palm of the hand. The winner was the one whose egg didn't break. The first egg-shaped confectionery was made by Italian-born Girolamo Jarin. Confectioners were often highly skilled and made a good income preparing elaborate sweets for the dinner tables of the Regency elite. In his book, The Italian Confectioner, Jarin included recipes for sweets shaped like eggs. His recipes were complicated and called for making eggshells shaped cases with sugar, nuts and fruit. The cases were wrapped around trinkets. Another of his recipes involved creating a sugar eggshell case to be filled with yellow cream that resembled egg yolks. Eating chocolate was not invented until the 19th century, when the first chocolate Easter eggs appeared. They were solid rather than the ones with hollow centres that modern people are accustomed to. Jane Austen's novels and letters reveal that Easter was a time when journeys were made to see different parts of the country and stay with friends and relatives. As in spring, the drier conditions on the roads made travel easier. For example, Jane mentioned in a letter to Cassandra, written from the 5th to the 8th of March 1814, that their banker brother Henry planned to visit his brother's country estate at Godmersham a few days before Easter. Jane's novels contain many mentions of family visits during Easter time. In Mansfield Park, Newly married Maria is staying with friends during spring when she elopes with Henry Crawford after her marriage. Mrs. Rushworth had gone for the Easter holidays to Twickenham with a family whom she had just grown intimate with, a family of lively, agreeable manners, and probably of morals and discretion to suit, for to their house Mr. Crawford had constant access at all times. Mr. Weston gives an optimistic view of springtime visits as he delights in the agreeable prospect that she shall have his son Frank the whole spring, precisely the season of the year which one should have chosen for it, days almost at the longest, weather genial and pleasant, always inviting one out, and never too hot for exercise. Travelling at Easter became so common that Easter marked the time when the season began for wealthy families to spend time in London. In Sense and Sensibility, Mrs. Jennings comments that all girls should wish to go to London. A visit to London provided wealthy young women with a chance to socialise, shop, attend balls and the theatre, and also increase their prospects of finding a suitable husband. In Pride and Prejudice, Jane Bennet goes to London in spring, but sadly she finds that her beloved Mr. Bingley does not know she is there, thanks to the scheming of his sister, who hopes he will make a more advantageous match to Georgina Darcy. Young ladies would often be sent to learn the skills they would need to attract a husband and befit them for fashionable society when families went to London. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is surprised that Mrs. Bennet did not ensure that her 5 daughters were taken to town every spring for the benefit of masters. Bath was another popular destination for spring visits. In Regency times, it was booming as a fashionable spa town where people went to drink the warm, mineral-rich spring water for its health benefits. Jane mentioned accompanying her uncle to take a glass of the famous spring water from the pump rooms in a letter to Cassandra. Servants were given holidays when their employers left their country houses to go to London or Bath for the season, though this holiday didn't officially begin until Easter Sunday. This was probably to give the servants a chance to clean and cover furniture and fittings in the house whilst the family were away, the origin of the idea of the spring clean. For those in or near the countryside, spring was a time for walks and carriage excursions, especially if guests were staying. This is something that newly married Mrs. Elton is keen on doing in Emma. My brother and sister have promised us a visit in the spring or summer at farthest, continued Mrs. Elton, and that will be our time for exploring. While they are with us, we shall explore a great deal, I dare say. They will have their barouche landau, of course. The barouche landau was an expensive, open-topped, four-wheeled carriage driven as an elite pastime. Mrs. Elton's repeated mentions of the carriage in a way that attempts to make herself sound superior are, not surprisingly, nauseating to her listeners. Just as in modern times, Easter was a time when school children had a holiday from studying, although, of course, in Jane Austen's time, only more privileged children went to school, as most school places had to be paid for. In Emma, the 2 eldest little Knightleys were engaged to pay their grandpapa and aunt a visit of some weeks in the spring, and their papa now proposed bringing them. The Knightley children must have looked forward not only to meeting their Aunt Emma and their grandfather, Mr. Woodhouse, but also seeing kind Mr. Weston, the new husband of Emma's former governess. He is praised for his benevolence to the children, particularly for flying Henry's kite for him that very windy day last Easter. Unlike little Henry Knightley, who plays outside flying his kite with Mr. Weston, Young Fanny Price in Mansfield Park spent her Easter holidays less happily learning to ride, which terrified her. Fortunately, her kind cousin Edmund teaches her riding with the help of an old grey pony, and she comes to enjoy riding. The exercise of riding is shown as being good for Fanny's health, and she rides out regularly. What might Easter Day have been like for Jane Austen or her heroines? Let's look at typical ways of spending a Regency Easter Day from start to finish. First up is getting dressed. There was a tradition to have new clothes at Easter, which would give good luck throughout the year. Some superstitions said that there might be dire consequences if no new clothes were worn, hence the origin of new Easter bonnets, which were easier to make and obtain than larger items of clothing like dresses. Bonnets could also be retrimmed, as Lydia Bennet plans to do with an ugly bonnet that she buys in Pride and Prejudice. Many of the ladies of the congregation at Steventon would doubtless have attended church service wearing their Easter bonnets and gowns made or altered especially for such an important holiday. Like many ladies of her status, Jane Austen would have altered garments to fit changing fashions and was a skilled seamstress. In his A Memoir of Jane Austen, Jane's nephew James wrote that her stitching might have put a sewing machine to shame. Jane Austen loved having the opportunity to go on a shopping spree whilst she was staying with her brother in London in April 1811. In a letter written to Cassandra, she confessed, "I am sorry to tell you that I'm getting very extravagant and spending all my money, and what is worse for you, I have been spending yours too. For in a linen draper's shop to which I went for checked muslin, and for which I was obliged to give 7 shillings a yard, I was tempted by a pretty coloured muslin, and bought 10 yards of it on the chance of you liking it." Many spring dresses were made of muslin, a lightweight material that was fashionable in the Regency era. Muslin gets several mentions in Jane Austen's novels. In Emma, Harriet Smith is tempted by everything and swayed by half a word, was always very long at purchase, and while she was still hanging over muslins and changing her mind, Emma went to the door for amusement. No doubt the fashion plates and advertisements in the popular Regency Ladies magazine would have been eagerly pored over and critiqued by shallow, fashionable Isabella Thorpe in Northanger Abbey. Much of Catherine Morland's time spent with Isabella in Bath revolves around shopping and comparing fashions. Isabella writes to Catherine about the new spring headwear in her typical exaggerated style. The spring fashions are partly down, and the hats the most frightful you can imagine. Not only outfits were renewed by fashionable Regency people in spring. In Persuasion, vain Sir Walter Elliot suggests that spring is a good time to begin a new beauty regime. I would recommend Gowland, the constant use of Gowland during the spring months. Mrs. Clay has been using it at my recommendation, and you see what it has done for her. You see how it has carried away her freckles. Gowland's lotion was a popular treatment for skin blemishes made from lead and mercury, ground in spirits and mixed with bitter almonds, sugar and distilled water. It is doubtful whether using dangerous ingredients like mercury and lead would really have done Mrs. Clay's skin the world of good that Sir Walter attributes to Gowland's lotion. Jane's niece, Caroline, recalled that her aunt enjoyed practising the pianoforte before breakfast when she could have the room to herself. Music is an element found in all Jane's novels. For example, Mary Bennet, though accomplished, plays with a pedantic air and conceited manner, and monopolises the instrument as she, in consequence of being the only plain one in the family, worked hard for knowledge and accomplishments, and was always impatient of display. Breakfast was usually eaten around 9 or 10 a.m. in Regency Britain, although Jane's novels mention characters breakfasting earlier before a journey. Although cooked breakfast did not become popular until the Victorian era, a Regency breakfast was a large meal by modern standards. Jane attended a public breakfast in Sydney Gardens when she was in Bath. Mrs. Austen wrote that a breakfast given her by a cousin at Stoneleigh Abbey in Warwickshire, there was chocolate, coffee and tea, plum cake, pound cake, hot rolls, cold rolls, bread and butter and dried toast for me. Coffee was a popular drink in Regency times, and coffee shops were set up where wealthy businessmen met to talk and read newspapers. Jane mentions drinking coffee at a musical soiree in London. Hot chocolate in the Regency era was made by grating a solid block of chocolate and melting the shavings in milk. Often a special chocolate pot was used, and many recipes called for the addition of spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. After breakfast, Jane Austen would have performed household chores and worked on her hobbies. Sewing was an activity that occupied women of all classes in the Regency era. Jane, Cassandra and Mrs. Austen worked on sewing a beautiful patchwork coverlet that is now in the Jane Austen House Museum. There are numerous references to sewing and other handicrafts being undertaken in Jane's novels. Drawing or painting were practised by Regency ladies throughout the year. In Emma paints her friend Harriet Smith as a classical goddess. Jane's sister Cassandra particularly enjoyed art. Reading was a popular pastime that gets many mentions in Jane Austen's novels and letters. Female literacy was growing in the Regency era, and ladies snapped up novels and books of poetry. Jane loved browsing through her brother Edmund's library at Godmersham Park and enjoyed being alone in the library, mistress of all I survey. The desire to immerse oneself in books is shared by book lover Marianne Dashwood, whose attachment to Mr. Willoughby is sparked as they discover a shared love of books. Another heroine especially fond of novels is Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey. The characterisation of both these heroines suggests the supposed perils of reading too much. Too much absorption in novels was seen by some as making ladies lose touch with reality by giving them an overly romantic outlook on life. Another new development for readers in the Regency era was the lending library. This was a popular place for avid readers who might not be able to afford to buy all the books they desired. With 5 daughters keen on reading books of various types, the circulating library was a boon to the Bennet family, although disapproved of by pompous clergyman Mr. Collins. The next time when Regency ladies would eat after breakfast was during morning calls. Morning calls could last up until 3 p.m. in Regency times. Jane often made calls on friends to take tea, and Pride and Prejudice mentions cold meat, cake and pyramids of fruit being served during a morning call. Upon arrival, ladies would be offered a small cake and something to drink, like tea, sherry or Madeira. The little cakes and biscuits enjoyed by ladies on morning calls contained flavourings like rose water and orange flower water that are less frequently used today. In Emma, Mrs. Elton finds fault with her new neighbours who make a poor attempt at rout cakes. Rout cakes are biscuits made with currants, orange water, rose water, sweet wine and brandy. Mrs. Elton also disparages her new neighbours for lacking ice cream. Ice cream was made using ice from ice houses mixed with salt and packed in a container into which a bowl full of whipped cream flavoured with sugar, fruit puree or floured water was placed. The mixture was whipped until it froze. Hot cross buns are a traditional Easter treat and may have been served during morning calls at Easter. Hot cross buns were said to have originated in the 12th century when they were baked by a monk. Superstition around hot cross buns include that those baked on Easter Sunday were thought to keep all year without growing mouldy. One hard and stale hot cross bun should be kept all year in the house in which it was baked to keep the house safe from fire. Another traditional Easter cake is simnel cake, a fruit cake with a layer of marzipan in the middle and marzipan on top, decorated with 11 or 12 balls of marzipan to represent the apostles minus Judas, or Jesus and the apostles minus Judas. Emma's father, Mr. Woodhouse, would not have approved of this treat as he disliked unwholesome cake. If a lady visited with her servant, then the lucky servant would usually be given some tea, bread and cheese, or a slice from a larger cake in the servants' hall whilst waiting for their mistress to finish her call. Promenading was an activity enjoyed by many Regency ladies when the weather was warmer. One of the aims of these leisurely walks or rides was to be seen and to meet others of the same social circle. In Northanger Abbey, Catherine Morland hopes the weather will improve so she can go for a walk with the Tilneys in the countryside near Bath. On their walk they spend time admiring the picturesque scenery and drawing, pastimes that many Regency people would have enjoyed on walks. In Emma, there is a lovely glimpse of how the sunny weather and emergence of spring flowers can impact on the well-being of those enjoying them. Here, Emma finds that the sunny spring weather has made her friend Harriet Smith happy. When she looked at the hedges, she thought the elder at least must soon be coming out, and when she turned round to Harriet, she saw something like a look of spring, a tender smile even there. Elizabeth Bennet is another Austen heroine who appreciates being outdoors in springtime, delighting that every day was adding to the verdure of the early trees. Jane Austen enjoyed making the most of the warmer weather in spring to get outside. She wrote to Cassandra that the fine April weather meant we do nothing but walk about. Towards the end of her life, when her health was declining, Jane continued to crave going outside in fine weather. In a letter to her niece, Fanny Knight, written on the 13th of March 1817, Jane said she planned to get a riding donkey so she could accompany Cassandra on walks now the weather was spring-like. On the 26th of March 1817, Jane wrote jokingly to another niece, Caroline Austen, "I have taken one ride on the donkey and like it very much, and you must try to get me quiet, mild days, that I may be able to go out pretty constantly." In Jane Austen's novels, we get a sense of the characters going about their lives against a picturesque backdrop, the like of which Jane knew herself growing up in rural Hampshire. Steventon Rectory, surrounded by meadows, had a walled garden with a sundial, espaliered fruit trees, vegetable and flower beds and grassy walks. This garden was tended by Jane's mother, who would have begun to be busy sowing, planting and, of course, weeding in spring. Doubtless the garden would have looked lovely in spring, with the fruit trees blossoming and newly planted seasonal vegetables beginning to sprout. The surroundings of Chawton Cottage hark back to Steventon Rectory, as it had a country garden with lawns, flower beds, an orchard, a shrubbery walk and a large vegetable patch. Mrs. Austen busied herself with growing fruit, vegetables and herbs at Chawton Cottage. There are many Easter-time traditions relating to the planting of seeds. On Palm Sunday, it was traditional to sweep the church and save the dust to scatter onto gardens before planting seeds to ensure a good crop for the coming year. One character who puts a lot of thought into her planting is Mrs. Grant in Mansfield Park. She is concerned that the mild spring weather may mean that tender plants cared for by her gardener Robert in the parsonage garden are liable to being caught out by an unexpected frost. Here are some of my plants which Robert will leave out because the nights are so mild, and I know the end of it will be that we shall have a sudden change of weather, a hard frost setting in all at once, taking everybody, at least Robert, by surprise, and I shall lose every one. Spring flowers would be found adorning churches, drawing rooms, dinner tables and ballrooms at Easter time. In a letter telling Cassandra about a party in London written on the 25th of April 1811, Jane mentioned, "The rooms were dressed up with flowers, etc. and looked very pretty." Hyacinths get a special mention in Northanger Abbey when Catherine Morland expresses her pleasure in seeing hyacinths to Henry Tilney. He responds, "But now you love a hyacinth. So much the better. You have gained a new source of enjoyment, and it is well to have as many holds upon happiness as possible. Besides the taste for flowers, it is always desirable in your sex as a mean of getting you out of doors and tempting you to more frequent exercise than you would otherwise take. And though the love of a hyacinth may be rather domestic, who can tell the sentiment once raised, but you may in time come to love a rose." For Regency men, there was a tradition of competitive sports and ritual combat at Easter. This relates to older traditions where spring and summer battled for dominion, as in Mummers plays showing the Holly King of Winter battling the Oak King of Summer. Wrestling, boxing and leaping matches were popular sports in the Regency era. No doubt John Thorpe of Northanger Abbey would have spent Easter shooting, hunting or driving his curricle, a small two-wheeled carriage. In Sense and Sensibility, Sir John Middleton is a keen hunter and sportsman and makes shallow judgments about other men based on how well they hunt. Hurling, where teams of men hurled a ball against the opposing team until one team won, is a time-honoured Easter tradition. Like hurling, Regency football was a game played in the street and had few rules. The gentry sometimes played games of cricket against their servants at Easter. However, Jane Austen's letters and novels tend to focus on female pastimes rather than male-dominated activities. For an Easter dinner, a special meal was not typically laid on. Easter was a large meal taken later in the evening than is typical in modern times, usually beginning at 8 p.m. in the houses of the gentry. Before dinner, wealthy people changed into special evening dress. For ladies, this usually meant styling their hair elegantly and donning a more elaborate dress with short sleeves and long gloves. Men wore a tailcoat, waistcoat and knee breeches with silk stockings, a cravat and thin shoes. When dinner was announced, the company processed into the dining room in strict hierarchy. The hostess made the seating arrangements according to rank, and some organised the seating of guests to pave the way for marriages, as unmarried ladies got seated near a suitable gentleman. The table would be splendidly set with silver, crystal glasses, candles, roasts, pyramids of fruit and sweetmeats, ornate jellies and flummeries, a sweet, soft dessert made with beaten eggs and milk and placed in a jelly mould. After a dinner party at Mansfield Park, Mrs. Norris takes supernumerary jellies to nurse a sick maid. The first course typically consisted of soup, meat and fish, pies and vegetables. The host would carve roast meat, while soup was usually served from a tureen placed at the hostess's end of the table. White soup, a pale, savoury soup made with chicken and ground almonds, is mentioned in both Pride and Prejudice and in the household book written by Jane's sister-in-law, Martha Lloyd. The table would be relayed between courses, as seen in Emma, where Emma and Frank Churchill pause their conjectures over who sent Jane Fairfax the gift of a pianoforte until the table was again safely covered when every corner dish was placed exactly right. As the footman cleared away the remains of the first course, imposing meat or poultry joints that served as conversation pieces were brought in. When hosting a dinner to be attended by Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, Mrs. Bennet did not think anything less than 2 courses could be good enough for a man on whom she had such anxious designs, or satisfy the appetite and pride of one who had 10,000 a year. Mrs. Bennet's fussing appears insignificant when it is considered that a Regency Easter dinner for the aristocracy contained 29 dishes in each course. Both ham and lamb were traditionally eaten at Easter time. New lambs were born in spring, and the ham would often have been the last of the cured meats left after winter. Lamb has symbolic associations due to Jesus being referred to as the Lamb of God, because lambs were a sacrificial animal in Christian tradition. For special occasions, lamb was often eaten soused with spices, lemon and wine. At the Box Hill picnic in Emma, the guests eat cold lamb. A lot of dishes on aristocratic menus have French names, and even Martha Lloyd's household book contains several French dishes, reflecting how fashionable French cuisine was, even though England was at war with France at the time. In Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. Bennet assumes Mr. Darcy has 2 or 3 French cooks at least. A French man cook was amongst the highest paid of servants, and Jane's banker brother Henry employed a French cook at his London home. Desserts consisted of fruit, jellies, creams, biscuits and wafers, ice cream, cakes and sweetmeats. Special confectionery chefs could be hired to create extravagant and breathtaking sweets to decorate the dinner table. Sugar confectionery and pyramids of fruit made popular desserts. In some households, decorative desserts would be placed on the table first, so guests could admire them as they ate the main course. Tansy cakes and puddings were popular at Easter, although it would be best not to eat too many foods containing tansy, which can be toxic if eaten in large quantities. When the men joined the ladies in the drawing room after dinner, tea, coffee and cake might be served whilst they played cards and listened to music or danced. Tea was often served by the daughters of the house, as the Bennet girls do in Pride and Prejudice, when Jane makes the tea whilst Elizabeth pours the coffee. In a letter to Cassandra, Jane Austen mentions drinking tea and playing cribbage with friends. Card games were popular with people of all classes and genders during the Regency era. Both men and women could lose fortunes at gambling. Elizabeth Bennet enters the drawing room at Netherfield Park to find the whole party at loo, and was immediately invited to join them, but suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it. Mr. Willoughby's attachment to Marianne Dashwood is made clear by many proofs during her visits to Barton Park, including, if their evenings at the park were concluded with cards, he cheated himself and all the rest of the party to get her a good hand. A key activity driving the plot in Jane's novels is attending balls, notably when Elizabeth Bennet meets Mr. Darcy for the first time at a ball where he declines to dance with her, claiming she is not handsome enough to tempt me. Balls would often be held on moonlit nights to help guests return home in their carriages safely in an era before street lighting. Another activity beloved of Regency ladies was attending plays, concerts or soirees during the spring season in cities like London and Bath. In April 1811, Jane went to the Lyceum in London to see plays by Shakespeare, and in March 1814 she attended a pantomime and a farce. Another colourful performance that Jane witnessed was the Indian jugglers who performed in Pall Mall. After all that excitement and variety, I'm sure that Jane Austen and her heroines would have retired to bed exhausted, but looking forward to the long days of spring stretching ahead.